Well, for the second quarter in a row, the Indian economy contracted by 7.5% during the July-September quarter and entered a technical recession in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. Analysts polled by news agencies Reuters and Bloomberg had expected a contraction of 8.8% and 8.2% respectively for the second quarter, but the results were better than expected and the economy contracted by minus 7.5%. Now, the real GDP for April-June 2020 had contracted by 23.9%, the steepest fall ever and the first contraction in 40 years. The July-September 2019 quarter had witnessed a GDP growth of 4.4%. The 8 core industries growth came at minus 2.5% in October against minus 0.1% in September. India's fiscal deficit stood at 9.53 lakh crore rupees during April to October, which is 119.7% of the 7.96 lakh crore rupees of the budget target. The revenue gap for the same period stood at 7.72 lakh crore rupees versus 5.46 lakh crore rupees on a yearly basis. In this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the GDP figures of Q2. Joining me on the program today are Ajay Shankar, former Secretary, DIPP, Ministry of Commerce and Industry; Abhinav Prakash, Assistant Professor, University of Delhi; and K. Badrinath, Senior Journalist. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Mr. Shankar, I'd like to begin the program with you first. How would you look at the recently released or the numbers of the Q2 GDP that were released a short while ago?
Well, there are different ways of looking at this number. So one way is what you suggested, that the expectation of some analysts was that we over 8%, 9%, and it's a little better, it's minus 7.5. So from minus 24 to minus 7.5 appears considerable progress. But it is still minus 7.5. And now in the coming quarters, we have to see how it moves. And one negative factor is that there is a spike in COVID cases in different parts of India. Another factor would be that in the second quarter, did we see a result of some higher numbers due to the pent-up demand of the first quarter? So one has to see how the next 2 quarters go. But clearly the positive is that it is slightly better than expected. One other factor which we have to bear in mind is that when do we start hitting positive territory? When we hit positive territory, how high is the growth rate? Because the key objective right now for everybody should be how quickly can we get the economy back to where it was in March 20 before the recession. Because it is technically a recession. It's too early to call it a depression or whatever the next few quarters will tell us. But getting back to March 2020 levels of economic activity should be our foremost goal, and we should try and get there as soon as possible.
Absolutely.
Go ahead. Okay, fine.
Go ahead, Mr. Shankar. One positive note.
Positive factor which is visually available to all of us and partly responsible for the spike is that people have regained some confidence, and the extreme fear of COVID has gone to a large extent, and that is a positive sign for economic activity.
K. Badrinath, let me come across to you now. How would you compare the numbers from Q1 to Q2? A considerable improvement if you look at the figures from the previous quarter to the present quarter reported.
Yeah, they definitely, I would not say very optimistic, but they're very challenging even now. But definitely better from what you have talked about, quarter one, where it was more than 23.6% contraction. Now we are just talking about 7.5% contraction. So what I'm trying to look at is, is the pent-up demand that was there in the first quarter got exhausted, number one. Number two, the festivities are over. And third party, in some of these cities, there is some kind of, restrictions which are coming back. At least in 4 or 5 states, you can see that some restrictions are back. Even Delhi is talking about having a night curfew and all that. So my guess is that recovery will not be even. Second part is it is going to be a very, very tough task to get back to where we were in March of 2020. And third part of this story is that we need not lose the optimistic feeling that we have that, well, things are very bad, it is not going to come back, and we are not going to be, I know the GDP or the economic growth is not going to be back. This need not be the situation. For example, if you go one step further from the GDP figures, coal, fertilizers, cement, and electricity. These are the four areas where you have already seen some positive growth in quarter two. And that means, and if you see the gross value addition to the economy, the contraction is even lesser at 7%. So if you consider these two things, and also if you see the core sector growth, all these three factors, if you see, then my guess is you will see a more optimistic figures or more optimistic scenario. But well, how the COVID will behave, how the businesses are going to behave, how the consumer is going to behave is the biggest issue. Consumer for both goods and services is going to behave. Is all what is going to be the key factors as to how economy will come back. You talked about the fiscal deficit figures. At this point of time, my guess is you don't need to worry too much about the fiscal deficit factors because even 9.63 lakh crores is okay because you must have budgeted for about 7.96 lakh crores and you're about 9.53 lakh crores right now. That doesn't matter. About 19%, 20% increase is just perfectly fine. You can roll over the deficit and you can always borrow more. But there is, because it's a very specific situation that you're going through. So
Absolutely.
fiscal deficit at this point of time could be a secondary factor, but getting demand back into the economy seems to be the biggest issue that it must be challenging. And perhaps this is perhaps consumption demand which needs to be revved up is what the government is also trying to push for. And
Sure.
all the relief packages that have been announced by the finance minister seem to have looked at pushing the consumption demand. And well, you will see, like Mr. Ajay Shankar had said, maybe the quarter three would still be in the negative growth if I suspect, and maybe quarter four you could see a positive growth perhaps. But even
Absolutely.
if you see the figures, the GDP figures seem to be much better than what Reserve Bank of India has talked about, which said that it will be about 8.6% down, but you are
Hmm.
at 7.5%. So my guess is that we may see a revival much better than what has been expected. Well, will the revival be V growth, V shape, W shape, U shape? Well, one doesn't at this point of time make a very informed guess, but
Hmm.
we can still think that it's very easy to say that growth will definitely be back. It will take at least 2 quarters,
Sure.
and by the end of the year, you should be getting into a positive zone.
Okay, all right. Since we are here then, since we are talking about several of the predictions so far, most predictions or almost all predictions that came through, Abhinav Prakash said that the contraction will be higher than 8%, but the economy or the numbers seem to have beaten all these estimates and these predictions and come in at minus 7.5%. What are the key factors that have, ensured that this has happened?
Well, Frank, so when you're talking about the economic slowdown, we have to keep in mind two things. There was a secular slowdown, which was ongoing slowdown before the pandemic hit us. And then there was a slowdown caused by the lockdown. Now, there were three main challenges posed by the lockdown. Number one was the challenges of the logistics. So once it's a lockdown, everything is shut down. or supply chains are disrupted, factories have stopped working. So of course that caused a very sharp decline in the output. The second challenge was that of the labor. So we saw these migrant laborers who basically work in these industrial centers and the cities and who are basically the driving force of our economy in the urban centers. There was a reverse migration of the labor. So labor was the second challenge, which was caused by the lockdown. And the third was the finance. Now, after the lockdown has been lifted in a systematic manner, the most of the constraints posed by the logistic disruptions have been normalizing. So we see a revival in the supply chains. Of course, it's a long way to go, but we see some normalcy returning on the logistic fronts, and the labor is also coming back. So most of the laborers who moved back to their villages, they're all coming back to Mumbai, Delhi, NCR, and all the industrial centers. So that thing has been sorted out once the lockdown has been lifted. But the problem of finance still remains, Frank, because the credit growth is not picking up, and that is causing the main constraint on the growth as of now. But if you look at the numbers, it's the manufacturing sector which has done well. It has a positive growth of 0.6%. The farm sector has done extremely well with a growth of 3.4%. Expected, you had lots of labor back in the villages. The government also pumped in lots of money in NREGA. So there was a good monsoon as well this year. So there were, gains in the output in the farm sector. So there was a vibrancy in the economic activity in the villages. And certainly the villages were not into that much of a strict lockdown as the urban centers were, because they allowed the agricultural activity to go on with some, restrictions, but overall they were allowed to function. The contraction which we see, Frank, is mostly in the construction, trade, transport, real estate. All of them have contracted by a very large number, and that remains a challenge because still the people are not traveling, as my co-panelists were talking about. So those transport, hotel, trade, I think they are very long way away from recovery. And also construction and real estate is a major concern, and the main problem there is of the finance. So how the credit is being channelized, how will that be done? That will determine the growth rate in the next quarter. Overall, it seems that economy is on a very positive track, because from 24% contraction to 7.5% contraction, defying all the prediction, it seems that economy is picking up momentum. But I will say we have to be cautiously optimistic about it. We have to see what is going to happen in the Q3.
All right, be cautiously optimistic. We need to see what is going to happen in Q3. Let's take a few aspects that both the panelists have raised forward now. Mr. Shankar, pent-up demand, festivities, and also what's likely to happen in the, as the weather changes and as we get into winter. Now, how big of a factor are these going to be going forward?
You see, the pent-up demand, we will assume, has been met. So in some senses, we are at a normal to the extent that COVID permits. And this COVID factor will stay with us certainly for a few quarters. So going forward, we have to see how demand will pick up on its own and what government can do or should try to do to get a revival of demand. And here there is one dimension which I think all of us need to ponder over, which is that India's growth story of the last few decades has been primarily consumer demand driven. And there have been many who look at the Indian economy on a structural basis and have been feeling that we need a shift from consumer demand driven to investment driven. Now, in the current situation where those who drive consumer demand, which is not the poor people, but what would be called lower middle class, etc., well, the large numbers of this great 300-400 million middle class of India, which is such a large source of demand globally. Now, their sense of confidence about the future has been shaken. So those who are entrepreneurs in, say, tourism or trade or restaurant or hotels, their incomes are not there. Those who were running shops are seeing some footfalls, but they're a long way from getting back to March levels. Many have salaries frozen or not sure whether they will be in jobs. Some have lost jobs. So there is a psychology which is not in favor of consumer spending the way it is in normal times. So the onus is on, I think, government and policymakers to see how to push up investment demand. Now, some measures were announced by the finance minister, like doubling the outlay for the housing program or another housing program for migrant workers coming back to the city. So the way forward would be for government to see where it can calibrate policy measures which would stimulate demand and demand for domestic goods and services rather than for imported goods. Now, so there are various options, and I think each one is on the table. Some is being implemented in some way, some will get hopefully implemented because government keeps saying that it has an open mind and is watching the situation carefully. So if you had a large government-driven drive for the commencement or completion of housing projects or other construction projects, and some of it you could do by providing money from the budget as a fiscal stimulus. Some of it you could do by extending the guarantee on bank credit instrument, which has been used to keep SMEs alive and which has been extended till March. So some guarantees for credit for stirring up or getting investment moving forward. Like the previous panelist has said that finance is a bit of a constraint in the housing sector. So one has to think lots of in terms of micro level analysis and seeing where demand can be generated quickly in the next quarter, the next 2 quarters. There's no point thinking mega infrastructure project where contracts will get awarded even if you take investment decision today after a year and a half. One has to look at where contracts can get awarded in the next month or the next quarter or the next quarter. And that is where I think some micro level fine tuning will be a continuing challenge for policymakers. There is one other dimension which is important for stirring up demand or stimulating domestic demand, and which is the national consensus behind reducing our dependence on imports from China.
Sure.
So there are a lot of finished goods which come from China. They were being made in India. They can still be made in India. They are being made in India. And we saw some signs of that during the festival season. So if we keep pushing the envelope on getting consumer behavior to prefer things made in India rather than imported Chinese goods, people going in a shop and asking, is this lighting or is this lamp made in India or from China? And the other, government imposing or raising import duties very selectively on such mass consumption items which come from China, and also maybe undoing the real exchange rate appreciation, in which case automatically what comes from China becomes more expensive and domestic producers get more space in the existing domestic market.
Right. Okay. So since we are here then, K. Badrinath, let's talk about the issue of credit as well, and how do we channelize it and how do we best, utilize it?
Okay. See, banks and their balance sheets are also in a very stressed way. And it is not that funds are freely available for whatever amount you want. But one figure I would like to bring in yesterday, which Mr. Nitin Gadkari talked about, is that in the last 6 months, about over 3 lakh crores has been accessed by the medium, small and micro enterprises. And this is a small money, and about more than 33.3 lakh enterprises, small businesses have accessed over 3 lakh crores. This is what he's talking about. And this is mostly maybe the guaranteed credit, the government is providing subsidy on interest, and the repayment is guaranteed to the banks and things like that. So what I'm trying to say here is that we need to look at, working towards protecting the integrity of the banking sector. At the same time, put our money where exactly that is required for immediate quick business revival that can happen. Many of these small businesses are facing two kinds of problems. One is the immediate working capital that is required, which needs to be given. Second is the cost effective credit that is required, and which is very small amounts. So if these two things can be arranged
Hmm.
by the government, a part of it is already been arranged. So if that can be tackled in a larger way, my guess is that